So this is really this is a very fine chapter out of Sutton's book, America's Secret Establishment. This is a chapter, How the Order Controls Education. And I want to point out that nobody but Sutton, in the writings on the order, has ever really dealt with education. Sutton saw the importance. I mean, he'd been doing all the work on our, aid to the Soviet Union on technology and all for the Hoover Institute. But he really, he's the only one who ever connected the order with education. Even this great book that we've all, that Sutton Leipzig Connection, this great book, I don't believe that Paoli Leone understood the connection with the order either. He wrote about Wundt. It's a fantastic little book. You couldn't get it. The viewers can get this book. I think it's, there are a few very important books on education. I'd say that this is the #1 book on education that's ever been written, this little book. And I think Anthony Sutton agreed, because he got a lot of his work in his book on the order from the Leipzig Connection as well. If we want to start with the condition of the average American right now, who has been conditioned by the television and in the schools and pretty much in daily life, with the community councils and all, it goes away from the individual. Everything is to get, well, John Dewey said it, we have to get rid of the individualism. Everything goes towards the collective, the group. And ever since the early 60s or 50s, they've had the training sessions going on. They started in Bethel, Maine, National Training Labs, to use sensitivity training to bring people together in groups, and they'd all spill their guts about everything. And once you've done that, you're dependent on that person, right? Because they know everything about you. So this is the way you form the collective. It really is very interesting, the sensitivity training, how it works. And it says right in the original documents that it's Chinese communist thought control. Well, Americans have been exposed to this now, certainly since World War II. And they've become little collectivists, really, groupies. They think that way. Anybody who thinks as an individual really is looked at askance, strange person, having an opinion that is opposite to what I've heard every night on the TV or in school or in college. Strange person, these individualists, huh? So that's what we're looking at now. We finally, this is very interesting right now. I mean, talking about the Rockefeller Foundation, the General Education Board of Carnegie, you have, this is the chart showing that the University of Chicago, the School of Education, which had John Dewey and Charles Judd were there. Columbia University Teachers College, John Dewey Thorndike, who had his pet chickens that he trained, James E. Russell, and then James McKell in the Department of Psychology at Columbia. All those were all funded, and Hopkins Medical School, by Rockefeller Foundation's General Education Board and Carnegie Foundation. Now, when you think back to everything I've been talking about, the Carnegie Conclusions and Recommendations to change the American education, 1934, to change American education from the standard, classical education that we have, basically to outcomes-based ed, because Carnegie, after they wrote that nifty little blue book that outlines a socialist America using Carnegie's views, they had something called the 8-year study, the Carnegie Corporation, which we didn't realize until I read something in the Education Commission of States used to have, or still does, maybe in Denver, has a newsletter. And I was reading it one day, and at the bottom of the page, I just saw something, and it said, OBE is simply because we were fighting OBE, outcomes-based education, performance-based education for workforce training, performance. And I turned the page, and I said, it's just a rerun, virtually, of the Carnegie Corporation's 8-year study. in the 1930s. And I went, what? And then we went and we got the whole 8-year study out of the University of Georgia Library, because the editor of my book lives in Athens, Georgia. And we got the 8-year study. And the 8-year study actually is what they're putting in right now. It's the no grades. It's removing the Carnegie unit, which requires the old Carnegie unit. You guys went through it in school. You know, we all did. 4 years of math, 4 science, 4 English, 4 history, whatever, in order to graduate. And all of that has been removed now because the student is not focusing on intellectual endeavor. It's workforce training. And so they're taking those years away, and they're taking A, B, C, D grades away. They're taking kindergarten 1, 2, 3 through 12 away. And the whole thing is an open system where the child proceeds at his own pace and has his own test. He's not being compared against anybody else, no competition, because he is the cog in the wheel. He's being trained for the state and the corporations, not for his own upward mobility. Forget classical education. That's what they're putting in right now. They're calling it Reinventing Schools Coalition. And interestingly enough, why I should be living in this small town of Dresden, Maine, where it's one of the pilots, one of the few in the country for it. I went over and I found out about it. Their whole goal was to turn education on its head into training, which is exactly what they wanted to do, because if you take the Carnegie's little conclusions and recommendations for the social studies, forget social studies, okay, I don't know why they call it that really. It was really conclusions and recommendations for the destruction of American education, that little book. By putting that new system in, and the very people who signed off on their report were involved in all of this. Columbia, George Counts, Rudd, Ballou, you know, all the names. And so Carnegie, whereas you had Hopkins and University of Chicago and all were putting in the method, Carnegie was advocating the change of our formerly free market system to a planned economy, Soviet style, through the schools. That's the little dark blue book, Conclusions and Recommendations. That is recommending a new form of government and economic system for the United States, and it clearly states in there the American people are going to have to get used to this, because this is the new order. That is these barriers are breaking down all over the world. We've got to have a world system and all. You know, this is all. I mean, this isn't direct quotes, but this is what the book tells you, and that the curriculum has to be completely revised from the old classical curriculum to focus on world government, basically. That's that little 1934 book. So at the same time, you had Columbia University and Dewey and all of them. Dewey, had, you know, a lot of them have been to the Soviet Union, George Counts, and they were just saying, this is the most wonderful system, blah, blah, blah. Well, you know, I think Counts recounted or recanted sort of at the end, you know. I think he realized, because things were getting pretty brutal in the 30s under Stalin. It was pretty hard to defend the system. But anyway, the goal, I think, people will always ask, well, why on earth did Wall Street finance the Bolshevik Revolution? Why would they do that? Well, I think they did it because Russia was a very, I don't think they did it because they were atheists or one thing or the other. I mean, William Boyce Thompson, he was first head of the Federal Reserve, I think. He put 100,000 of his own money into Russia. I think it was all greed, personally. I think that's why they initially started supporting the Bolshevik Revolution. I think they wanted to be in control of the natural resources. I'm talking about America's Secret Establishment by Anthony Sutton. I knew Anthony Sutton. We met. We both were working on U.S. Soviet policy. I used to be in the State Department, so I was interested in that too. But one day, he said, I'm interested in the influence of the order at Yale, and I said, "Oh, you are?" And interesting enough, I had just the day before received the copies of the membership in 3 or 4 little books. They're actually, we can take pictures of them if you want. I have them. And he said, "You have the membership list?" And I said, "Yes." And he asked me to send it to him, and I did. He promised he'd get them back, which he did. And he told me, he said, "Charlotte, I've been doing research for the Hoover Institute for several years on U.S. aid to the Soviet Union and wondering, what on earth are we doing? Why are we building up our enemy? I just couldn't understand it." And he said, "When I put all those names on the membership list that you had out on the dining room table, all of a sudden everything made sense. I saw the names of these very important people who were all involved in the defense contracts, who were involved in education going way back, everything. I saw what they were doing." And that was when he became, even, he really started focusing. And he wrote the book after he got the list. And I've always really liked that. This is a really good quote here that I like to use, because not just because the fellow that he's quoting was a friend of my father's, sort of interesting, but because it tells you exactly how important the Order of Skull and Bones at Yale is. People say, "Oh, it's a little boys' club," and they ignore it. They ignore the fact that John Kerry and George Bush were both running for president. They didn't. I mean, isn't this sort of weird that out of an organization that has a maximum, I don't know how many, maybe 12,000 members or less, since its creation, I don't know how many there are, that we would end up in a country of what? How many million are we? Having 2 people running for president who are out of Yale, the Order of Skull and Bones? I mean, that just doesn't make sense. So anyway, this is a quote that he has. This is from